Welcome back, adventurer. Tonight, the dust is heavier, not more plentiful. Dust is always plentiful. The shelves below Waterdeep have been patient enough to gather a proper kingdom of it, and kingdoms of dust rarely hurry. No, the difference tonight is weight. The moats do not drift so much as hang. Candlelight does not so much illumine them as discover them suspended in the air, like old verdicts waiting to be read aloud. That happens now and then in these lower stacks. There are nights when the archive behaves like furniture. There are others when it behaves like a court. This is a court night. The candles burn low and narrow. The shelves stand like witnesses. The stone beneath us keeps its old cool, as if the city above had never learned the trick of pretending warmth could count as innocence. Beyond these walls, Waterdeep continues its habitual pageant of appetite disguised as activity. Coins change hands, ships arrive with cargoes and excuses. Noble houses rehearse their genealogies as if bloodlines were arguments and not merely receipts. Somewhere an ambitious fool is calling the present age enlightened because he has not yet seen what memory does to that word. Down here, we do not insult history so casually. Down here, we keep company with wax, leather, iron clasps, lamp black, and the long ache of continuity. Down here, we remember what the city above uses up too quickly. You have returned to the hidden stacks. Welcome again to the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Irillian Cantonine, Baelnoran Lore Warden, custodian of failed simplifications, and one of the last reliable enemies of clean historical narratives still shambling beneath the stones of Waterdeep. I did not refuse death out of vanity. Vanity is for emperors, archivists, and younger mages who still imagine posterity is a prize. I refused death because memory without guardians decays into slogans with unnerving speed. The living remember banners and forget burial pits. They remember founders and misplaced refugees. They inherit ruins and then speak of those ruins as though they simply grew there, like moss on old stone. I remain because someone must stand in the way of that convenience. And because the people, for all their beauty, have made enough disasters to justify professional supervision. Before we open the drawer tonight, a small piece of modern business, since even old griefs now apparently require a modest amount of infrastructure. The website is live. taleofthelich.com now stands open, and more of the series' timelines, transcripts, and connective tissue are finding their way there with each passing interval. If, after tonight's lesson, you discover that one catastrophe is insufficient for your appetite and you require a properly ordered index of several more, that is where you should go. taleofthelich.com. A door in the modern wall. Miracles do occur. Some of them are merely administrative. Now then. Last time, we stood in the long shadow of the Third Crown War. We watched the Vishantar Empire cease pretending it wanted only correction and begin wearing dominion more honestly. We watched Malkazid, the branded king, lend a proud elven empire the most dangerous of gifts, not force, but sanction, not appetite, but the heavenly silhouette of grievance. We watched Chantel Othraya endure as one of the great counter-arguments in elven history, a mixed realm proving that plurality had not yet entirely perished under the Crown Wars. We stood at the Gods' Theatre, where tens of thousands died, and even that absurd field of slaughter did not teach empire to doubt itself. We followed Coronel Inloth to the threshold of defeat, and we marked Waterdeep as the kind of fragment history always underestimates until fragments become forests of refusal. And I told you, at the end, that the worst empires are not the ones that only know how to conquer. They are the ones that learn how to make conquest look like theology. Tonight, we pay the price of that lesson. Tonight, we step into the age when elven civil war stops being merely war and becomes something more poisonous: weather, verdict, curse. This is the lesson of the dark disaster and the descent of the drow. Do not let the familiar names make you lazy. Too many listeners come to this chapter thinking they already understand it. They have heard of the High Moor. They know what drow are. They know, in the broad and useless way, that the dark elves were cursed and driven below. They know enough to nod. Nodding is not the same thing as understanding. Tonight we must do harder work. We must recover Mierita not as a footnote to its own annihilation, but as a living realm with its own pieties, daily rhythms, and promises. We must look squarely at the dark disaster and admit that the record never gives us the comfort of clean attribution. We must watch the Fourth Crown War turn vengeance into policy and policy into fire. We must examine the ritual that transforms dark elves into drow and ask the question history is always begging posterity not to ask too clearly. What does it do to a civilization when it decides an entire people can bear the moral burden of a war? And then, my patient apprentice, we must go below, not romantically, not as tourists of the Underdark, as historians. We must consider what it means to be driven underground, not in poetry first, though there will be poetry enough, in logistics, in religion, in labor, in childhood, in hunger, in architecture, in scent, in what happens to a surface people when the sky is taken from them, and what kind of civilization grows when exile, necessity, and predation begin teaching the same lesson. Because the birth of the drow is not merely a magical event, it is an economic event, a social event, a theological event, a linguistic event, a civilizational fracture whose aftershocks continue into the so-called present, wherever surface folk still see a dark elf and think first of treason rather than history. There is no neat morality here. There is judgment, certainly. There is atrocity in abundance. There is guilt enough to feed 10 historians for 10 mortal lifetimes. But there is no neatness, and I distrust neatness more with each century. Before the first folio opens, a brief word from tonight's sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, builders of thoughtful web applications, resilient digital systems, and the sort of clean modern architecture ancient empires would have benefited from had they spent less time composing bloodline justifications and more time testing for catastrophic failure. If you need elegant front-end work, dependable back-end systems, or both joined with the kind of discipline that prevents the whole structure from collapsing the first time, reality proves rude, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They build with more foresight than most Crown War strategists ever managed. Now, Set your notes where your hand may find them later. You will want them nearer than usual. Because this lesson is not about one catastrophe. It is about the machinery by which catastrophes become normal enough to breed descendants. We should begin where the wound begins. Mieritar. If you know that name only as prelude to the High Moor, then you know it badly. Mieritar was not made to be remembered as a blasted plain. It was a forest realm, founded around -18,000 dollar reckoning by green elves and dark elves in the northwestern reaches of Faerûn, in lands later associated with the High Moor and the Misty Forest. In its great age, it was lush, old, and culturally alive in a manner that troubled its rivals, precisely because it did not fit their preferred hierarchies. Its people were not merely surviving among trees. They had made a civilization there. And before the Crown Wars, the faith of Eilistrae was strong in Mieritar, with only smaller pockets elsewhere among the dark elves and in other elven realms of the age. Pause with that. Do not rush past the goddess. Eilistrae matters here not because later ages grew fond of saying her name whenever they wanted a gentler counterweight to Lolth. She matters because Mieritar was one of the great places where dark elf life had not yet been locked inside the later Drow sentence. Before the curse, before the descent, before the long millennia in which later surface folk would flatten every dark elven face into the same suspicion, there existed a realm where dark elves and green elves had built something not only defensible but beautiful, and where the Dark Maiden's worship had real social depth. That means song. That means dance beneath moonlight. That means open glades rather than vaulted caverns. That means dark elf children growing to adulthood under trees rather than stone. That means rites that presumed the sky was not hostile. That means a people whose devotional grammar still expected return. Beauty, hunting, moon, feast and grace in the surface world, rather than the hard liturgies of secrecy, enclosure and subterranean fear. You cannot understand the later cruelty of the descent if you do not first understand that what was taken was not merely geography. It was a whole sensory order. Sky, season, moon, wind in leaves, the ordinary distance of the horizon. Evening as invitation rather than concealment. Later, Drow civilizations will grow formidable, intricate, and enduring. Let no sentimental surface elf convince you otherwise. Adaptation is not trivial, and the dark elves who become Drow will prove far more civilizationally capable than many of their judges deserved. But adaptation is not acquittal for what was done to them. There is a vulgar habit among later historians of praising the resilience of survivors in tones suspiciously close to congratulating the disaster. I have outlived enough empires to despise that habit properly. Yes, the exiles endure. That does not justify the sentence. Mieritar had already been under Arivandaran occupation by the end of the First Crown War, though resistance endured for centuries after the banners changed. Many Mieritari fled or hid. Ilafan, despite official neutrality, provided secret safe havens for refugees. Thus, by the time we arrive at the dark disaster, Mieritar is not an untouched kingdom awaiting first violence. It is a conquered land, still alive in resistance, memory, and unresolved legitimacy. This matters immensely. A ravaged country and a dead country are not the same thing. A conquered country and a forgotten country are not the same thing. The empire had taken Mieritar militarily. It had not persuaded the land, the memory of the people, or the loyalties of all its survivors to agree. That is the condition in which some of history's worst decisions are made. When a conqueror has won the map but not the moral climate, when the conquered are no longer strong enough to force a clean reversal, yet too alive to stop contradicting imperial certainty. When the world above the roads looks pacified, but below the canopy the realm still refuses to die in spirit. It is very difficult for proud powers to tolerate such ambiguity. That is why occupied lands so often become laboratories for either atrocity or legend, sometimes both. In Mieritar, daily life under conquest would not have consisted only of dramatic skirmishes. History is rarely generous enough to keep itself at theatrical temperatures. More often, occupation settles into humiliations, shortages, inspections, altered road authority, changed tax expectations, new legal habits, temple scrutiny, confiscation of magical works, and the incessant uncertainty of not knowing whether the stranger at your hearth is a refugee, a collaborator, or an informant. Farmers still must know which groves can be harvested. Hunters still need to return with meat. Priests still must keep old feasts as carefully as they can without inviting too much attention. Children still grow, which means they also listen, and what they overhear becomes the next generation of grievance or accommodation. That is the real danger of long occupations. They are educational. They train the conquered in caution. They train the conqueror in rationalization. And they train both in the terrible art of learning to live alongside something that should have remained intolerable. Mieritar also occupied a peculiar position in the moral geography of the Crown Wars. To Arivandar, it had long represented a rival mode of elven excellence. Not merely another realm, but a place whose cultural style, mixed population of green and dark elves, and prestige complicated sun-elven narratives of proper hierarchy. To Ilithir, it represented kinship of a sort, or at least a dark elven connection through which the larger wars could be narrated as righteous intervention. To later memory, it would become a martyr realm, but martyrs are easiest to admire once they are dead. The living Mieritari had the harder task. They had to remain both conquered and unassimilated, visible enough to matter and hidden enough to survive. This is where the faith of Eilistrae becomes especially poignant. Her later priestesses are charged to encourage Drow to return to the surface world and to promote harmony between Drow and surface-dwelling peoples. That mission, in later ages, is so often treated as a kind of noble impossibility that listeners forget it implies an earlier wound. One does not speak ceaselessly of return unless something vital was lost. One does not build a faith around restoring harmony between deep-born dark elves and the surface unless some original dislocation turned both sides suspicious and cruel. Mieritar is one of the places where that lost world still stood before the sentence fell. This is why the dark disaster cannot be understood as merely strategic escalation. It is sacrilege against possibility. It destroys not only a resisting land, but one of the strongest surviving proofs that dark elf life on the surface had once belonged, had once flourished, had once known beauty without the architecture of exile. When later Ilistraean rites are performed under the moon with such aching insistence on dance, song, kindness, and surface life, they do not arise from abstraction. They arise from memory older than the curse. Even where that memory has become fragmentary, the longing remains precise. Now, because the record is stubborn in the right places, we know certain particulars of the disaster's physical character. The killing storms of the dark disaster lasted for months. Their mists were black and olive. Their rains came thick, foul, and ichor-choked. When the storms had finished, the forest realm stood as an open poisoned waste, the land later remembered as the High Moor. We also know that while many fled before the storm's advance, many innocents died, and that 90 dark elf wizards, together with 3 high mages of Mieritar, went into the heart of the storm a month after its origin to attempt a counterspell. None returned. Nothing remained to be found but ash and ichor. Those are among the cold facts. Hold them close, because nearly everything around them becomes contested. And Contest Apprentice is itself one of the story's central features. The sources refuse to give us clean certainty about who caused the dark disaster. Even elven records are divided. Some old traditions speak of high mage sympathizers within Mieritar harnessing forbidden and blasphemous magics against fellow elves, a taboo so severe that even later retellings seem reluctant to fully unfold it. Others point toward the high mages of Arivandar, their greater numbers, their greater power, and their political connections to the increasingly deranged ambitions of House Vishan. Later compilers say flatly that no proof could be found, even while many believed Arivandar responsible. In other words, history gives us what history often gives when a civilization has already grown ashamed of its own capacities. Not certainty, possibility bordered by accusation. You may find that frustrating. Good. You should. A false clarity would flatter us. If the culprit could be named beyond all contest, later generations could tuck the whole matter into a simpler box. A crime with one author can be narrated as deviation. A crime whose authorship remains disputed inside a whole civil war is more troublesome. It asks whether the civilization itself had by then produced too many actors capable of conceiving such a thing. That, I fear, is the darker truth. Whether the final hand was Arivandaran, Mieritari, some collusion, some failed counterwork, or some still more tangled sequence lost in the mists, the dark disaster was born from a world in which enough elves had already learned to think imperially, vengefully, or despairingly enough for such magic to become imaginable. That is not absolution for anyone. It is a more frightening indictment. And because later elven memory cannot quite bear that indictment in full, the uncertainty remains active. It becomes fuel. Arivandar can be blamed, and often is. The occupied can be suspected of desperate blasphemy, and sometimes are. The disaster thus does double work. It destroys a realm materially, and then it destroys trust interpretively. Every survivor, every ally, every rival realm afterward must live with the fact that one of the great crimes of elfdom has no universally accepted culprit, only concentric circles of guilt and fear. Let us walk, as far as language permits, into the storm itself. I am aware that some listeners love catastrophes best when they sound operatic. Fire from the sky. A single name cried out, a villain in silhouette. The mountain splits, the sea swallows, mortals tremble. Very grand, very convenient. The realms, alas, tends more often toward the intimate obscenity of lingering ruin. The dark disaster lasted 3 months. 3 months. That duration matters. A blast kills and is done. A storm teaches dread. It gives time for rumor to outrun reality, for refugees to arrive before the full shape of the thing is understood, for prayers to curdle into bargaining, for roads to clog, for noble houses to decide which relics are worth a child's place in the wagon, for priests to discover that the liturgy they trusted does not clearly account for black rain. Imagine the sound of a forest kingdom learning that weather has ceased to be neutral. At first, perhaps, it is merely wrongness, a smell where no smell should be, a dampness with no freshness in it, leaves taking stain, animals bolting too early, too directionlessly, pools filmed with something oily, the sky not merely darkening, but thickening. Then the mists, black and olive, cloying, creeping, swallowing distance in an unnatural register, making familiar glades seem already half buried in some future memory. Then the rains, and the rains not as cleansing, but as corruption, striking bark, soil, roof, skin, and stream alike. What does a kingdom do when it cannot tell whether the land itself is being murdered or merely made unlivable? It flees where it can, it argues, it denies, it sends scouts who do not return. It sends mages who do, then fewer do. At some point, the people of Mierittar must have understood that the question was no longer whether the storm could be endured, but whether anything recognizable would remain when it passed. That is the point at which a homeland becomes an archive rather than an address. Even before the last rain falls, everyone inside the event begins living between two names for the same place, what it has been and what it is about to become. 3 months is long enough for a country to die publicly, long enough for the living to watch it happen. And then there is the decision of the 90 dark elf wizards and the 3 high mages. I want you to linger there with me, because this detail is among the most piercing in all Crown Wars lore. A month after the storm begins, they go into its heart, seeking the place of power where a counterspell may be cast. They know, or surely must suspect, that they may not return. They go anyway. This is not the gesture of a people who have become caricature. This is not the social world of later surface prejudice, where every dark elf prior to the descent is retroactively sorted into a single treason-colored drawer. These are wizards of Mierittar, dark elves among them, walking toward annihilation in an attempt to save their realm. Say it aloud if you must. Dark elves walked into the center of the dark disaster, trying to stop it. You will need that sentence later when the curse arrives and later ages start pretending the category of dark elf had already become morally simple before the gods and priests made it simpler still. No, history is not so generous to bigotry. The sentence came after this complexity, not before it. The loss of those counterspellers also marks something else. The failure of elven magical confidence on one of the largest stages imaginable. The first flowering had taught the Telkesir to trust that sufficient wisdom, ritual discipline, and communal high magic could shape civilization itself. Mythals, wardings, great works of civic enchantment. The old arts were not merely weapons, but constitutions written in power. To send 93 mighty spellworkers into the storm and receive back only absence is to suffer not merely a tactical defeat, but a theological one. It means there are now magical events on the mainland before which even old elven mastery breaks. That fear does not vanish when the storm ends. It becomes one of the conditions under which the next horror becomes possible. Now we should say clearly what the dark disaster made of the land. Mieritar became a wasteland, the blasted plain later called the High Moor. The forest died, not all at once in every retelling, but decisively enough that the realm's identity as living woodland civilization was over. And the High Moor remains one of the great map arguments of Faerûn, proof that ancient magical crime does not stay in the past merely because the guilty die. Long after the names of many participants had fallen into scholars' dust, the land still kept the verdict visible. That matters for how the realms works. Faerûn is not a setting in which history politely exits once it has happened. Ancient war remains in the topography. Old magic lingers in soil, ruins, bloodlines, monster ecologies, trade routes, and inherited fears. The High Moor is one of the clearest examples. Travelers in later ages need not know the full tale of Mieritar to walk inside its aftermath. Campaigns happened there because history did not leave. The Crown Wars are not a closed chapter bound in elfskin and shelved where only sages go. They are underfoot. Now ask the more difficult question. What did the disaster do to those who survived? Not abstractly. Specifically, refugees fled, some into allied or sympathetic realms, some into already strained communities, some no doubt into forests and borderlands where names mattered less than whether the next campfire could be hidden. Priests of Eilistrae lost congregations, temples, roots, sacred places, moonlit practices, and the ordinary geography of belonging. Dark elves already under suspicion from the wider wars now had their ancestral or adopted homeland transformed into poisoned waste. Surface allies who had sheltered Mieritari now had to distinguish amid panic and blame between victims, fighters, suspected collaborators, and those who simply carried the wrong complexion in the wrong century. Disaster is never merely destructive, it is classificatory. It forces frightened societies to sort one another under pressure, and frightened societies sort badly. This is where collective punishment begins growing roots even before the famous curse. Once a calamity on this scale has struck, publics become hungry for simplification. Someone must have done this. Someone must symbolize it. Someone must carry the charge long enough for grief to feel structured. The longer the culprit remains uncertain, the more tempting it becomes to transfer blame from actors to categories. Do you see the road opening before us? First, the insult, Dairo, traitor, gathers heat around the Ilithiri and other dark elves associated with the southern atrocities. Then Mieritar dies in a storm whose authorship remains uncertain, but whose victim population includes many dark elves. Then vengeance seeks an object broad enough to hold the pain. By the time the ritual of transformation arrives, the emotional infrastructure for collective punishment has already been built. The curse is not a lightning bolt from nowhere. It is the final legal theological expression of habits of blame that war had been schooling into elven society for centuries. And yet the immediate reaction to the dark disaster, according to the strongest timelines, is not an instant renewed war, but a horrified pause. Some chronologies speak of a scant 2 decades before large-scale conflict resumes. Others describe roughly 4 decades of uneasy peace, as nearly every elf of Faerûn recoils from what the Crown Wars have wrought. I advise you not to fuss too proudly over the difference. To a race that counts centuries more readily than most humans count seasons, either measure means the same thing. The pause was brief, too brief for healing, long enough for fear to settle into doctrine. That pause is sometimes overlooked because listeners rush toward the Fourth Crown War and the Descent, as though history, once it learns speed, never slows again. But pauses matter. They are where cultures decide what story they will tell about the thing that has just happened. In those bitter decades, every surviving elven realm had to interpret Mieritar. Was this the work of Arivandar's madness? Was this what resistance had summoned down upon a conquered land? Was the mainland itself becoming unfit for continued plural elven civilization? Could high magic still be trusted? Could the gods? How should dark elves now be spoken of? How should high mages? Should the answer be repentance, restraint, revenge, seclusion, or prayer? A civilization does most of its future-making in such interludes, and because no consensus strong enough to halt the slide emerged, the pause became merely the intake of breath before the next convulsion. Here we should say a necessary, uncomfortable thing about piety. In the aftermath of the dark disaster, prayer is not only devotion, it is statecraft by other means. When later sources tell us that over 1,000 priests and high mages in neutral Ilifan and other free areas spent decades in fervent prayer for salvation by Corellon Lorethian and the Seldarine gods, that is not quaint religious color. It is evidence that the surviving mainstream of elven power had begun to ask heaven to solve a civilizational problem that politics and war had made unbearable. Once a people begins asking the gods for a settlement to problems it no longer believes mortal judgment can fairly manage, very dangerous answers become possible. Remember that. The gods are not always asked for mercy. Sometimes they are asked for closure. And closure, in the hands of the frightened and righteous, is one of the cruelest things in the world. Now we may enter the Fourth Crown War properly, though notice how improper that word properly sounds in this context. The numbering suggests sequence. Sequence suggests order. Order suggests intelligibility. The reality is a tangle of overlapping resentments, staggered offensives, strategic withdrawals, local burnings, and old wounds refusing to take turns. Still, the broad shape is clear enough. After the dark disaster and a brief period of shocked stillness, Ilithia launches what the chronicles call a seething counterattack to avenge Mieritar. In this phase, the dark elves of Ilithia openly employ the corrupt powers of Gornador and other dark, evil gods for the first time. Whatever secrecy or deniability had once shrouded the older pacts is gone. The war becomes spiritually explicit. That matters. Open worship changes the moral temperature of a conflict. Private corruption can still be treated as aberrant influence within a realm. Open divine alliance means the realm has revised its public understanding of what sort of power deserves obedience. This is not merely a military adaptation, it is a redescription of legitimacy itself. Think back to Wendonai in the earlier wars. The Baela's great achievement was not simply handing out strength. It was teaching Ilithir that desperation could be narrated as special clarity. Once a people believes that the old rules have only protected its enemies, taboo begins to look like vanity. After Mieritar's destruction, that lesson finds its fullest field. What had been temptation becomes doctrine. The gods, or at least powers claiming godhood, most suited to wrath, secrecy, slime, devouring, and pitiless advantage, now appear not as fringe seductions, but as relevant patrons for an age that has decided civilization must speak more harshly if it wishes to survive. There is always a constituency for that argument. Among the powers named most clearly is Gornador, the elder elemental god, lord of slimes, oozes, hidden hungers, things that flow beneath the ordered skin of the world. He is not, as later shallow tellings sometimes suggest, merely a grotesque curiosity for underdark cults. In a time like this, a power like Gornador offers very specific ideological comfort. He sanctifies the collapse of form. He mocks the polished pretensions of the Seldarine. He tells the embittered that what is formless, devouring, subterranean, and unclean may be more honest than the radiant lies of court and grove. Such a power does not create civilizational bitterness from nothing. He receives it, shapes it, feeds upon it. And because Ilithia has already spent centuries learning brutality, the open use of such patronage does not feel like an alien imposition so much as a grim unveiling. The realm becomes more itself in the worst way. This, too, is why I resist easy moral binaries in the Crown Wars. Arivandar is still monstrous. The Vishantar project remains the original imperial engine of the age. But by the Fourth Crown War, Ilithia is no longer merely the wronged South striking back at northern arrogance. It has become a power willing to answer catastrophe not with tragic nobility, but with more expansive corruption. The burning of forests, the use of enslaved dragons, the normalization of fiend-tainted or god-corrupted methods. These are not the tools of a realm trying to restore justice. They are the tools of a realm teaching itself that justice is too small a word for what it now wants. And what it wants, increasingly, is for the world to feel its wound. There is a vulgar kind of audience that calls this understandable. Do not be one of them. Wounded powers are among the most dangerous powers in history precisely because they can dress appetite as injury. The claim to vengeance is morally potent. It recruits sympathy more easily than naked conquest. It tells the self a flattering story, that every excess is still downstream of something done to us. By the Fourth Crown War, Ilithir has learned to wield that story with grim fluency. Meanwhile, Celtimere stands in the middle, opposed on one side by the Vishan of Arivandar, and on the other by dark elven forces, including the clan Huon of Ilithir. Celtimere strategically withdraws from eastern territories and holds its lines at Highland's Edge. This is one of those details that later summaries reduce to a military note, when in truth it represents a vast civilizational choice. Retreat is not always weakness. Sometimes retreat is the last form of intelligence available to a realm surrounded by fools. Celtimere, unlike Arivandar and Ilithir, still retains enough sanity to understand that holding everything may mean losing everything. To withdraw and fortify is to admit that glory cannot pay for annihilation. It is also to condemn border populations to sacrifice. Every strategic withdrawal writes grief unevenly across the map. Those within the defended heartland call it prudence. Those abandoned to the new frontier call it something else, and often with justice. At Highland's Edge, then, Celtimere is not only drawing a line on the land, it is redefining what parts of itself can still be promised protection. The old eastern breadth gives way to a harder, narrower self. That is one of the Crown War's recurring effects. Realms do not only lose battles, they lose confidence in the scale at which they can honestly imagine themselves. Once Celtimere pulls back, Arivandar and Ilithir are increasingly thrown against each other in what later tradition names the Stone and Claw campaigns. For 2 centuries, battles rage across giant-infested mountains and Wemmick-claimed plains north of Celtimere. Again, do not dismiss the geography as ornament. Giant country and Wemmick country are not blank spaces between elf narratives. They are reminders that when great elven realms exhaust themselves, they do so within a wider Faerûn already inhabited, already dangerous, already full of peoples and ecologies whose own histories are not obliged to remain background scenery. A civil war between immortals does not pause the rest of the continent. It merely makes the whole continent more opportunistic. The Stone and Claw campaigns also teach us something important about the war's duration. 2 centuries of incessant fighting between Arivandar and Ilithir after Celtimere's withdrawal means generations of soldiers, scouts, priests, refugees and camp followers are raised inside chronic conflict. Children born after the Dark Disaster reach maturity knowing no mainland order except fortifications, watchfires, recruitment, and the moral simplifications war always teaches the young before exacting the bill later. Chronicity hardens societies. It turns emergency into institution. The extraordinary becomes procedural. This is how later atrocities stop shocking their own authors. They have been rehearsed too long. Now we return to Chantel, because even in its conquered condition, it continues to suffer the war's full cruelty. Through enslaved dragons and other powers, the dark elves of Ilithir engulf all of Chantal Othraya in flames over the course of 50 years, destroying over 70% of its trees. 50 years. Think about that duration against the nature of forests. A city may be rebuilt by one generation. A forest of that age and cultural depth is not so easily recalled. To burn it over decades is to ensure that children grow up thinking char, smoke and thinned canopies are ordinary components of homeland. Chantel had already fallen politically. Now it is unmade ecologically. This matters more than later human readers often grasp. Elven realms are not merely governments operating in forests. They are civilizational expressions grown with them. Roads, sacred glades, burial places, seasonal rites, hunting patterns, diplomatic routes, artistic materials, food economies, and social memory all braid through woodland continuity. Burn the trees, and you do not merely destroy cover or lumber. You destroy the medium through which the society knows itself. This is why fire is such an old enemy in elven history. It is not merely destructive, it is anti-archival. It erases the living arrangement of memory. And so the Fourth Crown War broadens the wound opened by the Dark Disaster. One realm is turned into moorland death, another is burned for 50 years. Keltormir contracts inward, Ilifan prays, Arivandar postures as empire, Ilithir answers with darkness made public. The mainland becomes progressively less able to imagine a future in which broad, plural, forest-based elven civilization survives intact outside enclaves, retreats, or miracle. That narrowing of the future is essential to understanding why the Seldarine-directed ritual becomes acceptable to so many. Societies do not usually leap to collective punishment from comfort. They leap when they have convinced themselves all narrower instruments have failed. Now, there is one more thread of the Fourth Crown War that deserves a colder lamp: the movement of Clan Sethemir and the foundation of Narathmalt. Around minus 10,400 Dala reckoning, dark elves of Clan Sethemir travel by magic to the Rildath, guided by Wendenai, and construct an underground fortress named Narathmalt, the Dark Pit, at a site recognized as a place of great evil. This is a small detail only if one has never learned to respect the importance of preparatory geography. Narathmo tells us that some among Ilithir are already thinking below the world before the general descent arrives. That is important. The Underdark does not begin at minus 10,000 with a single universal scream and a synchronized dive into caves like actors missing subtlety. Certain lineages, warbands, and cultic powers had already discovered, explored, used, or prepared underground routes, warrens, or fortresses. The deep world was becoming thinkable, tactically and spiritually, before it became compulsory. That matters for two reasons. First, it explains how the later retreat can happen with such unnerving speed. Peoples do not vanish below in 2 months unless roots, refugees, and habits of descent already exist in some form. Second, it shows that corruption and adaptation are intertwined long before the curse. To seek great evil beneath the earth is not the same thing as being forced there. Narathmalt is not yet the universal sentence. It is the avant-garde of one dark turn within Ilithir. Later, after the transformation, the dark elves of Narathmor are similarly changed. Their bindings over fiendish forces shatter, and they themselves must flee deeper and farther, eventually toward the caverns beneath lands later called Thay. The point is not merely that a fortress existed. The point is that one line of dark elven history was already experimenting with the deep as sanctuary, arsenal, and spiritual consonance before the rest of their people were broadly driven from the surface. This is how exile acquires prefigurations. History rarely invents whole destinations at the hour of catastrophe. It notices that some extremists got there first. Remember that when we talk of the descent, the name suggests a single act. The reality includes many preliminary stairs. Now let us return from Narathmol to the wider mainland, where the prayer of Ilafan and the free areas continues rising decade after decade. Over 1,000 priests and high mages spend years begging Corellon and the Seldarine for salvation from the corrupt dark elves of Ilithir and their continued destruction of forest homelands by fire. Do not mistake this for passive spirituality. It is organized civilizational appeal. It says, "We, the still orderly, have reached the edge of mortal adjudication. The old politics are exhausted. The wars have escaped proportion. We require divine settlement." One hears in this prayer both desperation and a dangerous innocence. Desperation, because the facts justify fear. Ilithir is indeed burning realms, using corrupt powers, embracing gods once hidden, and helping make the mainland unlivable. Dangerous innocence, because those who beg the gods for final settlement often imagine the gods will distinguish cleanly where mortals have blurred. They expect heaven to be more precise than history. History almost always laughs at that expectation. The ritual to come will not only punish the guilty, it will expose how readily frightened civilizations confuse broad category with lawful target. And once a civilization has learned that lesson through divine-seeming means, the damage lasts for ages. So let us arrive, without haste and without sentimentality, at -10,000 Dollar Reckoning, the descent of the Drow. Already you can feel the modern listener wanting to simplify. The phrase sounds decisive. It sounds like revelation, or perhaps punishment at last. It sounds like the story has finally reached the part later ages think they know. This is where good and evil separate, yes? This is where the traitors become visibly what they always were, yes? This is where the dark elves go below, and the rest of the elves remain above, the moral map restored, the future prepared for every later adventurer to kill Drow without overthinking history. No, that is precisely the laziness the archive exists to resist. According to the strongest canonical traditions, Corellon's magic, directed through his priests and high mages, transforms the dark elves, whether the corrupt Ilithiri or others, into the Drow. Whether by magic or by the weaknesses that thereafter banish them from the sunlit lands, all Drow retreat within 2 months into the Underdark. 1 month later, the Seldarine summon elven leaders to the site that becomes Elven Court to settle differences and restore peace. Read that carefully. Whether the corrupt Ilithiri or others. Others. The word is doing an immense amount of moral work. It means the transformation is not narrowly confined to the most visibly guilty war makers. It reaches beyond the manifest authors of southern atrocity. It sweeps up dark elves more broadly, including those whose histories run through places like Miaritar, whose mages died trying to stop the dark disaster, whose pieties ran to Eilistrae rather than Lolth, whose only stable crime in the eyes of many later judges is that they shared ancestry, skin, and category with those who had indeed become fearsome. This is collective punishment. Let us not varnish it. One may argue about motive. One may note the terrible context. One may insist, as many elven apologists across the ages have insisted, that the Ilithiri had become too corrupted, too dangerous, too spiritually compromised to be safely left as they were. One may even attempt the grand old dodge of saying that gods see deeper than mortals, that the spell was not merely punitive but revelatory, or that all dark elves had somehow been touched enough by the war's corruption to warrant the change. I have heard all of it. I remain unimpressed. The sources themselves refuse such comfort because they preserve the word others, and once that word survives the centuries, the moral problem survives with it. This is the moment when a civilization, exhausted by war and terrified by its own fractures, decides an entire people can bear a judgment too large for the guilty alone. There are eras in history when that move is applauded. Those are seldom good eras. Now, you may ask, what precisely changed? The later drow are marked physically by the familiar obsidian skin and pale hair of the deep elves, though some pre-descent dark elves were already called dark for the hue of their skin before the transformation. The ritual does not invent darkness out of nothing. It fixes, distorts, and overwrites. It makes category visible in a new, durable, inheritable way. It turns civil war accusation into bodily sentence. It creates a people whose faces will henceforth be read as verdict before speech begins. This is one of the oldest techniques of collective punishment. Make the punished legible at a glance. Let identity itself become the evidence. That way, posterity need not remember the case, only the mark. And what of the word? Earlier in the Crown Wars, we spoke of Darrow, traitor, the term that gathers around the Dark Elves as outrage, fear, and condemnation thicken. By later ages, the word drow stands not as accusation, but ethnonym, the name of a people. Whether every philologist would accept a simple straight line from one form to the other matters less than the historical truth before us. Accusation hardened into identity. The insult outlived the argument. The category became the community. That is what collective punishment does at the linguistic level. It teaches descendants to inhabit a noun grown from a sentence. Now, one of the most revealing ambiguities in the canon lies in that phrase. Whether by magic or by the weaknesses that banish them from the sunlit lands, all drow retreat within 2 months into the Underdark. This ambiguity is exquisite and terrible. Did the ritual itself impose new vulnerabilities that made surface life untenable? Did the transformed Dark Elves suffer such spiritual, magical, or social rupture that continued life under the sun became impossible? Did the other elves, now armed with divine-sanctioned differentiation, make certain by force that the newly made drow could not remain? Did fear shame, retaliation, and practical necessity converge so fast that the question of choice became nearly meaningless. The sources do not fully settle it, and perhaps they cannot. Because mass expulsions are almost never caused by one thing alone. They are produced by the convergence of panic, vulnerability, and opportunity. If a transformed dark elf found that light now wounded differently, that old magic faltered, that neighbors stared in horror, that priests spoke of divine verdict, that roads closed, that houses panicked, that armed kin had already decided the forests must be purified, how much would choice signify in the decision to go below? Very little, I think. Perhaps less than later polite histories would like, within 2 months. That too should chill you. A people does not vanish beneath the world in 2 months unless many conditions have already been prepared. Routes existed, warrens were known, some redoubts, such as Narathmolt, already stood. Slaves, stores, cultic networks, war bands, hidden caverns, deep trails, and old exploratory knowledge must have been marshaled in haste. Surviving nobles gathered what people, slaves, and equipment they could seize and fled into underground warrens they had earlier discovered. Later, Drow memory calls this dispersal the scattering, and from it would arise the many rival cities and lineages of the deep. Do not romanticize that flight. Scattering is a polite word for civilizational triage. It means families broken, temples abandoned, books left because food mattered more. Children told not to look back because looking back would kill what little resolve remained. It means taking servants, prisoners, and whatever labor could be compelled, because below the world, survival becomes immediately infrastructural. Who can carry? Who can mine? Who can guard? Who can spell the way open? Who knows the secret stair? Which animals can be driven? Which gods will answer now? A surface people becoming a subterranean diaspora in 60 days does not become morally better by necessity. It becomes more desperate. Desperation is a superb breeder of bad institutions. This is where the birth of later Drow society truly begins. Not at the instant of transformation alone, but in the pressure cooker of forced descent. You asked for depth, not summary, so let us speak plainly about what it means to be driven underground. First, food changes. Surface elves of forest realms know hunting, gathered foods, seasonal abundance, fruiting, canopy ecologies, glade animals, surface streams, moonlit foraging, woodland rhythms. The Underdark offers none of this in familiar form. There is water, yes, but often hard-won, foul, hidden, dangerous, or politically controlled. There is food, but much of it is fungi, lichen, deep moss, subterranean beasts, and herd animals like deep Roth. Later Drow and Duergar communities make deep Roth a staple diet, while fungal ecologies become part of the very smell and texture of underground life. Merchant links, slave labor, and careful control of water and edible growth become central to survival in ways surface woodland cultures need not have imagined with the same intensity. This is not a decorative change. It alters social relations. A civilization that once drew much of its life from distributed woodland abundance now increasingly depends on controlled caverns, guarded growths, herds that require protection, and labor systems harsh enough to maintain them in a dangerous environment. That favors fortress thinking. It favors coercion. It favors lineages capable of defending stores and roots. It favors concentration of power. Second, distance changes. On the surface, distance is largely horizontal. Forest path, river bend, ridge, clearing, glade. Below, distance becomes vertical, constricted, folded, riddled with choke points, shafts, bridges, fissures, and routes that may be traversable to one people and death to another. A society adapting to that learns secrecy differently. Map knowledge becomes survival. Households that know one safe route to water or one hidden stair to a defensible cavern possess more than convenience. They possess leverage. Geography becomes political in a harder register. Third, light changes. This is obvious but not simple. The surface is not merely visible, it is temporally legible. Dawn, noon, dusk, moonrise, season, weather, stars. These are calendars and emotional regulators alike. The Underdark strips much of that away. Later Drow cities simulate time in other ways, by magical cycles, heated pillars, regimented bells, priestly schedules, and civic routines. But the psychological cost of losing the sky should not be underestimated. A people shaped by moonlit ritual and woodland spatial memory now grows children for whom outside is no longer horizon, but rumor, raid target, ancestral wound, or blinding threat. That is how exile becomes culture. A temporary shelter teaches patience. A generational refuge teaches identity. Fourth, labor changes. Later, Drow societies rely heavily on slaves, on captured labor, on merchant networks staffed in part by non-Drow, and on harsh hierarchies within noble houses. In Lolth-dominated communities, the noble houses come to center economic and military power, headed by matron mothers and supported by priestly sanction, while merchant clans and non-Drow labor sustain survival and exchange. I am not saying all of this sprang perfect and complete on the second day after the descent. That would be absurd. But the forced move into a resource-tight, hostile, difficult environment strongly favored the development of institutions in which concentrated houses, coerced labor, guarded trade, and strict internal hierarchy could persist. Survival economies are not innocent merely because survival is involved. A people under pressure does not automatically build justice. It builds what it can maintain. And if vengeance, fear, divine humiliation, and prior corruption are already in the bloodstream, what it maintains may be very ugly indeed. Fifth, religion changes. This deserves its own candle. Before the descent, the dark elven religious field is not simple, but neither is it yet the later stereotype in which Lolth fills every shadow as though no alternative ever existed. Ilistrai's faith is strong in Mieritar. Other loyalties exist. Wendonai's corruptions and the open rise of Gonador's worship during the Fourth Crown War have already shifted the landscape. After the transformation and retreat, however, the conditions of the deep reward certain divinities differently. A goddess of ruthless survival, hierarchy, and sanctioned cruelty in a world of enemies can claim a great deal from a traumatized people. Powers of secrecy, slime, vengeance, and predation likewise find eager hearers. Eilistrae remains and later calls the drow toward return and harmony with surface peoples, but the field in which her call is heard has become much harsher. Think of what the curse does to a devotee of Eilistrae. Your surface rights are broken. Your homeland is lost. The moon you once danced beneath becomes distant memory or dangerous longing. Your people are marked. Your kin are driven into stone. Those who claim to represent the Seldarine have helped enact the sentence. How simple, then, will faith feel? It will not. This is one of the great underappreciated tragedies of the descent. It does not only create enemies for the surface, it also strains the inner religious life of the exiled. To remain devout in goodness after such a verdict is no light achievement. That later Eilistraean tradition survives at all is evidence not of easy hope, but of astonishing stubbornness. Sixth, childhood changes. Yes, I speak of children often. Someone in history should. A dark elf child born in Miaritar before the descent would learn forest sound, moon rhythm, community paths, seasonal gatherings, and the ordinary surface assumption that trees arch overhead, because that is where life belongs. A child born after the descent into the deep learns something else entirely. Torchless dark, fungal smell, stone acoustics, guarded cisterns, slave bodies, whispers about the surface, noble rivalries sharpened by scarcity, and the sense that one's people are hated above and endangered on all sides. Raise enough generations in such conditions, and the exile ceases to be an event. It becomes the baseline from which values, fears, ambitions, cruelties, and dreams are formed. That is why I refuse to discuss the drow, as if the curse alone explains them. The curse marks. Exile educates. Those are related, but not identical acts. And because later surface elves often prefer not to distinguish them, they come to treat all drow culture as proof that the sentence was justified, rather than asking how much of that culture was shaped by the sentence's own violence. This too is one of history's oldest crimes. Judge the exiled for the deformities of exile. Then call yourself righteous for having predicted them. No. We will do better than that here, or we will do nothing worth doing. Let us stay below a little longer, because most retellings flee too quickly back upward, as though the Underdark were merely where the cursed disappear until a ranger or adventurer requires them later. That is surface vanity. For the exiles, the deep is not narrative storage. It is the whole world remade under compulsion. Picture the first generations after the descent. The old surface categories have not yet settled into the later polish of great drow cities. Everything is rougher, more provisional, more frightened, and therefore more formative. Caverns are measured for defensibility before beauty. Water is counted. Fungi are cultivated where possible, harvested where not, hoarded when blights strike. Deep Roath are herded not because anyone dreamed of a noble pastoral beneath the earth, but because meat, hide, bone, burden, and continuity matter terribly in a world where every supply line is uncertain. Metal becomes precious differently. Timber is no longer ambient, but imported, scavenged, traded, or replaced. Smoke behaves badly below. Sound travels treacherously. Light is tactical and often unwanted. Architecture, therefore, changes character. Surface elves build in conversation with living woods. Even where they carve or shape stone, they still imagine openness, curve, growth, and the interpenetration of craft with canopy and sky. Beneath the world, architecture begins as refusal of collapse. Hold the ceiling, secure the ledge, guard the bridge, conceal the store, harden the choke point. Beauty may return later, and in some drow cities it returns with great and terrible sophistication. But the first question is not elegance. It is whether the cavern kills you before your enemies do. This tends to produce a different politics of habitation. Surface forest realms can distribute families, shrines, hunting parties, outlying halls, glades, hidden retreats, roads under leaves. The deep pressures concentration. To survive, one gathers around defensible voids, known water, workable fungus fields, secure beast pens, and priestly or magical centers capable of warding against monsters, cave-ins, rival houses, and whatever else the dark invents. Concentration breeds authority. It also breeds surveillance. When everyone necessary to survival is physically nearer, privacy shrinks and hierarchy intensifies. You begin to see why noble houses become so potent. A great house in the deep is not merely a lineage bragging about blood. It is an engine of provision, defense, magic, priestcraft, and coercion. It feeds, arms, punishes, and remembers. Those within it survive by belonging. Those outside it bargain from weakness unless backed by merchant wealth, priestly office, or private arcane force. In later drow cities, noble houses hold the bulk of economic and military power, while merchant clans, often filled with or dependent on non-drow labor, handle dangerous trade with outsiders and form the links that allow the greater system to endure. Again, I am not claiming a perfect matriarchal house-state springs full-grown from the cavern wall the week after the curse. I am saying the conditions of exile favor its development. Resource concentration, defensible enclosures, prestige lineages already habituated to command, the need for rigid internal order amid external danger, the legitimizing convenience of ruthless gods, the labor demands of subterranean survival, the temptation to convert prisoners and conquered neighbors into infrastructure. This is how cultures become sharper, narrower, and harder. It is also how they become durable. And durability is not the same thing as moral health. Now, about labor. Later, drow societies make extensive use of slaves, especially non-drow, goblinkin, orcs, hobgoblins, humans, craftsmen, laborers, guards, and all the unfortunate categories the powerful find most convenient to name after conquest. Merchant houses rely heavily on non-drow managers and assets. Even in older lore, the trade links sustaining drow noble houses are deeply entangled with those who are not noble and often not drow at all. Beneath the world, this is not mere cruelty for its own theatrical sake. It is system. Someone must herd, haul, mine, maintain, guard, cook, carry, and die in the outer dark so that the inner elite can remain elite. Surface listeners, when they hear this, often congratulate themselves too swiftly. They say, "There, you see, the deep-made monsters." The archive answers, "No, the deep made visible what enough prior corruption, plus enough pressure, was already willing to organize. Slavery does not emerge from geology alone. It emerges from the union of fear, hierarchy, and the decision that some lives may be rendered structural. The Underdark does not absolve that. It only rewards it efficiently. Trade also changes character below. On the surface, merchants can move by road, river, sail, gate, caravan, woodland route. Below, routes are fewer, more dangerous, and often monopolized by those with the power to secure them. This makes trade politically intimate. Merchant clans become vital because they perform the demeaning but necessary work of dealing with outsiders, carrying goods across perilous passages, bargaining with other subterranean peoples, and sustaining the noble houses that like to imagine themselves above such sordid dependence. In later custom, many of the managers and low-ranking assets of such clans are not drow at all. That is a reminder worth keeping. A dark elven civilization driven underground does not become isolated in the simple sense. It becomes entangled. It must. Trade, raiding, slavery, alliance, and predation all knot it into the wider ecology of the deep. This matters to the future of Faerûn because the rise of drow civilizations below southern Faerûn by around -9600 Dale Reckoning is not merely an ethnic survival story. It is the birth of a new geopolitical actor in the Underdark, one whose constant harassment of Vishantar forces over the next centuries helps prevent the Empire from annexing Keltormir or other lands. There is a bitter irony there. Those broadly punished and driven below become in time one of the factors that check the Empire, which helped bring the age to disaster. History sometimes manages that sort of crookedness, not justice, something harsher. Now, let us speak of religion again, but more closely. Lolth, before the descent, is already moving in Ilithir through Wendenai's influence and the broader corrupt bargain struck by various nobles. After the descent, her future dominance among the drow is not simply because she is evil and they are conveniently labeled evil. It is because she offers an explanatory system well matched to post-descent conditions. She sacralizes hierarchy. She naturalizes treachery within bounds she controls. She converts scarcity into station-seeking. She turns a traumatized people's rage outward and inward at once, producing cultures where fear, ambition, gendered authority, divine unpredictability, and ritualized cruelty all reinforce one another. It is a terrible fit, which is to say, a very good fit. A weaker deity might have failed to convert exile into civilization. Lolth thrives on exactly the sort of wounded pride, enclosed paranoia, and status hunger the descent helps create. Her priestesses can say, in effect, the surface rejected us, the weak betrayed us. Only through ruthless strength, holy fear, and our queen's favor can we avoid extinction. In a lightless environment full of enemies, that rhetoric is persuasive. It promises meaning where the old world ended. It converts humiliation into superiority theater. Do you see how hard it would be for Ilistrae to answer that, even while remaining true to herself? Ilistrae's message is slower. She does not flatter rage as efficiently. She offers song, dance, swordcraft, hunt, beauty, moonlight remembered, and the possibility that drow may yet return to the surface world and live in harmony with others. Beautiful, yes. Necessary, yes. But for the newly exiled, hungry, terrified, marked, and surrounded by enemies or opportunists, that message may sound like either impossible tenderness or dangerous nostalgia. To follow Eilistrae in the deep requires not only moral courage, but a willingness to remain haunted by the surface without letting that haunting become hatred. Few civilizations under crushing pressure produce such citizens in abundance, and yet some do. That is why the later Eilistraean tradition matters so much, not because it disproves the Drow's darkness as a slogan, but because it proves the curse never fully erased the older possibilities buried under it. The Dark Maiden's faithful keep alive the memory that dark elves once belonged under the moon. Their rites, especially those conducted on the surface whenever possible, are not merely quaint reversals of Lolthian practice. They are acts of historical resistance. Each dance beneath moonlight says, "We were not always meant for stone alone." Each call to return says, "Exile may educate, but it need not own the whole soul." I suspect that is one reason later surface elves find Eilistrae's followers so unsettling. They are evidence that the sentence exceeded its target. Evidence that the old official story, dark elves became drow because they were drow in spirit already, fails before lived counterexample. Evidence that one can inherit the mark and still reject the meaning later ages assign to it. History hates evidence that embarrasses simplification. So do priesthoods. Now consider identity in the first generations below. If your grandparents remember trees and your parents remember the flight, but you have never seen the moon except in stories, what are you? Exile-born, surface-born, cursed, chosen, wronged, rightly punished, heir to a destroyed civilization, founder of a new one? The answer depends on who controls the nursery, the altar, and the archive. Noble houses will answer one way, Lolth's priestesses another, Eilistrae's scattered faithful a third, merchant interests a fourth. The child will learn whichever answer most consistently feeds, protects, terrifies, or exalts. This is why archives matter. A people stripped of place becomes more dependent on narrative. Tell the child the surface cast you out because it feared your rightful strength, and you breed imperial resentment. Tell the child the gods cursed you because your people betrayed the moral order, and you breed humiliation or obedient piety. Tell the child both, skillfully interwoven, and you breed the perfect instrument for a cruel civilization, proud, wounded, suspicious, and hungry to transmute inherited shame into rank. Such children become excellent servants of spider queens and ambitious matrons. They also become, on rare and precious occasions, rebels. Because narrative cuts both ways. Memory of loss can radicalize toward cruelty. It can also radicalize toward return. Now the dry, practical matter of scent, because historians who ignore the senses are merely counting ghosts. Later, lore notes the all-pervasive smell of damp rock, mold, fungus spores, incense, drow bodies, and slave bodies in subterranean environments. That background does more than texture a dungeon. It teaches the nervous system where home is. Surface memory, in contrast, would have smelled of loam, leaf, rain, animal musk in open air, bark resin, river, blossom, and seasons. Change the air, and you change recollection itself. The exile from the surface is not only political and religious, It is olfactory, tactile, acoustic. The hands learn different walls, the ears learn different distances, the feet learn different caution, the lungs learn different weather. All this to say, when later ages meet the drow, they are meeting not merely cursed dark elves, but the children of a sensory revolution enforced by divine social catastrophe. And later ages, being lazy, call that revelation evil. No, it is history, sometimes terrible history, but history nonetheless. If you want a shorter sentence, apprentice, here is one. The descent did not just move a people. It changed what a people had to become to go on living. That is why this episode is not merely about the birth of a curse. It is about the birth of a civilization under sentence. But history does not end when the punished vanish. That is another of the victor's preferred lies. Once the drow go below, the surface elves do not wake in peace to birdsong and absolution. They wake inside the afterlife of the decision they have helped make. 1 month after the descent, the Seldarine summon important elves, high mages, nobles, priests, to the site that becomes Elven Court, there to settle differences and restore peace among the elves. Hold that image carefully. After millennia of civil war, after the destruction of realms, after the broad transformation and expulsion of the Dark Elves, the gods call a court. There is something almost unbearable in that sequence. Too late, one wants to say, and yet not too late for the future. The court matters enormously, and next episode we will walk through its authority, its compromises, and its long shadow. For tonight, the important thing is this. The summons itself proves that even after the curse, peace has not simply emerged by removing the marked category. The surviving surface elves still need adjudication. They still need settlement. They still need a higher convening. The civilizational disease was never confined to the drow. Again, no neatness. And there is bitter proof immediately. Around -9900, Arivandar begins covert persecution of high mages and priests, seeking to destroy or control anyone who might somehow force their descent as the Dark Elves were forced. Ponder that with the seriousness it deserves. An empire that benefited from a divinely directed collective punishment now fears the precedent of such power being turned against itself. Of course it does. States adore exceptional judgment when aimed at their enemies. They discover principle only when the method becomes reproducible. This is one of the finest moments of naked political honesty in the whole late Crown Wars, though it comes cloaked in secrecy. Arivandar's leaders have watched priests and high mages serve as channels for a civilizational sentence. The lesson they learn is not remorse. It is vulnerability. Whoever can do this again is dangerous. Therefore, the doers must be controlled. This is how the Empire mask rots from within. The very structures of elven religious magical authority invoked to solve the Dark Elf problem now become suspect to a power that realizes heaven's language, can strip rank from flesh faster than any battlefield can. In other words, the curse does not restore trust. It destroys it more subtly. And the victims of that new fear are not abstract. Ilefan, long one of the more neutral and spiritually serious elven realms, and its colony in the Luerwood are annexed by Arivandar as their priestly and high mage nobility die under the persecutions of the increasingly crazed coronal Gilvas Vishan. Many elves of both lands flee to the remnants of Chantel Othraya. Look at the chain clearly. First, the Empire wages prolonged war. Then, catastrophe destroys Mieritar. Then, the Dark Elves are collectively transformed and driven below. Then, the Empire, frightened by the mechanism of the judgment, turns upon high mages and priests among the surviving surface realms. This is not restoration, it is institutional panic wearing formal robes. And it reveals something crucial about collective punishment as a cultural trauma engine. It never ends where its first target stood. Once a society legitimizes broad categorical judgment, everyone begins imagining themselves as possible future categories. Fear spreads laterally. Priests fear rulers, rulers fear priests, neutral realms fear annexation, moderates fear extremists. Refuge becomes thinner because every refuge now looks like a political statement. This is one reason surface elf cultural amnesia about the Crown Wars grows so thick in later ages. To remember honestly is to recall not only what was done to the Dark Elves, but how profoundly the surviving mainstream harmed itself afterward. Amnesia, then, is not mere forgetfulness. It is self-protection. Now consider the map again. By around -9800, the Vishantar Empire's forces occupy all elven realms save Keltormir, stretching from the high forest of Arivandar to the southern forests of Ilithir. They begin the colonization and settlement of Evermeet. At roughly the same time, a large force of Luir elves flee the oppressive mainland and settle in isolation in the mountains of the Moonshae Islands, founding Sinoria under their queen. There, in just a few lines of chronology, you can watch the future branching. One branch is Imperial Overreach, the Vishantar project at its widest territorial ambition, convinced still that dominance is destiny. Another is Refuge, Evermeet, beginning to matter not merely as mythic promise, but as practical alternative. Another is Diaspora, the Luir abandoning the mainland for the Moonshaes, carrying continuity into isolation. What do all three have in common? They are responses to the collapse of faith in a shared mainland future. The Crown Wars do not only destroy realms, they destroy confidence that the mainland can continue as the unquestioned center of elven civilizational life. Evermeet's later role as refuge, symbol, and eventually isolationist aspiration does not emerge from aesthetic preference alone. It emerges because the mainland taught the people too much about what they were willing to do to one another. Sinoria, likewise, is not merely a picturesque colony. It is a vote of no confidence in continued mainland sanity. And below, in the same general span, the first drow civilizations begin to rise beneath southern Faerûn. Their harassment of Vishantar forces over the next centuries helps prevent total annexation of Keltormir and others. This means the post-descent world is instantly more complex than surface triumphant memory would prefer. The cursed and exiled do not simply disappear into deserved darkness. They become organized powers with agency, memory, hatred, gods, trade, and war aims. The surface, meanwhile, fragments into empire, refuge, diaspora, court, persecution, and exhausted enclaves. If a listener asks, did the descent solve the problem? The only honest answer is this: it solved nothing. It changed the problem's shape, and in changing it, it gave later ages a lie they could live inside more comfortably, that the moral fracture had gone below, leaving the surface cleaner than it was. No, the surface remained contaminated by its own decision. That is why every later attempt at drow surface reconciliation is so difficult. The difficulty is not merely that the drow remember exile and respond with raids, suspicion, or theologies of domination. It is also that surface elves and surface realms remember the descent as either justified or too sacredly embarrassing to examine. Reconciliation requires both memory and repentance. The realms is historically rich in the first and often poor in the second. Now let us return to the phrase collective punishment one last time, because I do not want you to hear it as if it were only a moral label I have pinned to an old magical event. I mean it analytically. Collective punishment acts as a trauma engine because it reshapes every layer of later life. It teaches the punished that identity itself is unsafe. It teaches the punishers that categories may be more meaningful than persons. It teaches descendants on both sides that memory need not be precise so long as it remains intense. It creates incentive for the punished to huddle more tightly into essentialized community. It creates incentive for the punishers to patrol boundaries more fiercely. It makes mixed loyalties suspicious. It turns conversion, return, dissent, and reconciliation into threats to the story that keeps the trauma organized. That is why drow who reject Lolth later face difficulty not only from other drow, but from surface peoples who have grown accustomed to the convenience of a total category. That is why Eilistray's call remains so radical across the ages. That is why later exceptions matter so much and are so often disbelieved. That is why one famous ranger wandering the cold north in a much later age can unsettle the realms so profoundly without ever needing to explain the full crown wars to every suspicious innkeeper he meets. The shock lies not only in him, it lies in the 10,000-year durability of the sentence he contradicts. There, one carefully earned forward glance. No more than that. The point is not fan service. The point is duration. When a people is marked by category, the mark outlives empires. And finally, let us speak of shame. Not guilt, shame. Guilt says, I did wrong. Shame says, what we are, or what we fear we are, cannot bear clear light. The post-descent surface world is full of shame. Arivandar's persecutions reek of it. The need for Elven court reek of it. The flight to Evermeet and Sinoria carry some of it. The later softening, mythologizing, or flattening of the crown wars in surface memory carries oceans of it. Shame is what makes archives necessary, because ashamed societies remember selectively, and selective memory is the favored accomplice of repeated crimes. If I sound severe tonight, it is because severity is sometimes mercy toward the dead. The dead of Mieritar deserve better than flattering vagueness. The transformed dark elves deserve better than the lie that they were all one thing before the curse. Even the surviving surface elves deserve better than a history that lets them hide from how badly their remedies failed. And you, sitting there with ink on your fingers, or a glowstone by your elbow, or whatever contrivance your age now uses instead of properly sharpened quills, deserve better than the cheap version in which history becomes cleaner as soon as one category of people is driven underground. History almost never gets cleaner by burial. It gets darker. There is another misconception the surface cherishes because it makes the story tidier, that the drow went below into emptiness. No, they went below into someone else's night. The Underdark was not a vacant basement waiting politely for exiles. Even in these ancient ages, it already held powers, ecologies, roots, predators, and civilizations. Dwarven realms had long histories beneath the mountains. Illithid powers such as Orindol were already taking root or rising toward consequence. Deep beasts, sentient slimes, Quotoa enclaves, cloakers, aberrations, goblinkin, and nameless things older than reasonable cartography all contested the dark. To be driven underground, then, is not merely to lose the surface. It is to enter a world already crowded with hungers. This fact is central to the development of drow society. An exile entering empty caverns might preserve more of the surface order. An exile entering a peopled, dangerous underworld must militarize faster, bargain harder, and learn to treat neighbors as prey, rivals, clients, or nightmares. The first great drow adaptations are therefore diplomatic as well as logistical. Which powers can be traded with? Which must be deceived? Which can be enslaved? Which routes run beneath dwarven patrols? Which caverns are already claimed by creatures immune to persuasion? Which gods speak most convincingly in a world where every crossing might end in ambush? Thus, the deep teaches a harsh curriculum. You cannot rely on open woodland retreat when the tunnel behind you also has owners. You cannot assume neutrality from a race that has every incentive to see your sudden arrival as invasion. You cannot afford moral innocence when scarcity and predation are already structured into the environment. Again, this is not absolution, it is context. A historian who confuses context with absolution is merely a propagandist with a longer bibliography. Now consider warfare under those conditions. Surface elven war, even at its worst, still unfolds in spaces where movement, concealment, and supply possess a certain breadth. Armies march, forests burn, roads matter. Skirmishers disappear into trees. Cavalry, archers, and mages all operate within a visible horizon of sorts. Underground war is different. It rewards ambush, poison, bottlenecks, sabotage of bridges and ledges, nightless discipline, scouts who can read stone and scent and minute vibrations, and command structures capable of acting in fragments. You do not conquer a cavern system as you conquer a valley. You seize access, you hold water, you deny fungus fields, you poison cisterns, you enslave the neighboring labor pool, you collapse the route behind the raiding band, you make withdrawal almost as deadly as defeat. Is it any wonder that later drow cultures become so adept at covert action, assassination, trapcraft, poison use, and layered internal hierarchy? They are not merely wicked for the sake of later monster manuals. They are children of bottlenecks, and bottlenecks breed specialists in treachery. Even their famed magical tendencies make harder sense below. A cavern city cannot always spare massed formations in the human fashion. It leans instead on elite force, priestly terror, localized magical superiority, hidden roots, and the capacity to make a smaller number of defenders seem larger through terrain and enchantment. Trade likewise becomes inseparable from espionage. A merchant house that knows the route also knows the choke points, the tolls, the tribal feuds, the monster territories, and the secret ways around them. In such an environment, commerce and intelligence are siblings. No wonder the later drow find surface merchants so charmingly naive. Now let us turn from warfare to art, because civilizations do not survive on terror alone, however much tyrants would like to believe otherwise. What happens to art when the sky is removed? At first, perhaps, art contracts toward the portable and the inward. Song survives because breath survives. Dance survives because the body still remembers. Ornament survives because even the exiled will not permit necessity to own every surface of life. Hair, blade, silk, glyph, jewelry, insignia, ritual scar, house emblem, private shrine, carved lintel, and the careful aesthetics of rank all become more important when the environment itself offers less beauty for free. A surface people accustomed to lovely settings often grows more elaborate personal display once removed from them. The body becomes a site of civilization when the homeland can no longer carry so much of it. This helps explain the later drow love of fine craft, dramatic attire, dangerous elegance, and symbolic display. Under such conditions, beauty hardens. It becomes an assertion that exile has not reduced the people to mere burrowing endurance. But beauty in a traumatized hierarchy also becomes weapon. Rank is worn, threat is aestheticized. Seduction, terror, and status begin sharing a wardrobe. This too is a survival strategy gone morally barbed. Music changes as well. Surface song offered upward, deep song ricochets. The acoustics of stone train different voices, different performances, different uses of silence. A hymn under trees dissolves into night. A hymn in caverns clings, returns, accuses. I would give a great many things to hear the transitional music of the first exiled generations properly sung. It must have carried an ache later ages only half remember. Old surface cadences adapted to stone. Moon remembering melodies made tactical. Laments forced to survive alongside victory songs for raids no one would once have imagined necessary. Civilizations do not become alien to themselves all at once. They overhear their own change first. Now think of law. Surface elven law, at its best, has room for custom, region, ritual authority, negotiated lineage rights, shrine prerogatives, and the soft coercions of a people with long memory and relatively low birth rate. Underground law, especially under pressure, becomes more immediately entangled with survival. Food theft is no longer petty misbehavior if a fungus field barely supports the cavern quarter. Route disclosure is not mere indiscretion, but treason. Failure in watch duty can destroy a house. Obedience becomes sharper because environment punishes error more swiftly. The gods one elevates under such conditions will inevitably shape legal sensibility. A Lolth-ordered city learns to treat suspicion not as vice, but as prudence. A merchant-controlled quarter treats contract and betrayal as twin skills. A militant enclave prizes capacity over contemplation. The law bends toward those who can claim they are holding collapse back another year. Once that happens for enough generations, mercy begins to seem like a surface luxury. I do not say this to endorse it. I say it because later, surface moralists often judge drow societies without asking what sort of law any people would build after being marked, expelled, and forced to survive amid constricted resources and omnipresent threat. The answer is not, they would become noble because suffering ennobles. Suffering often brutalizes. The miracle is never that some become cruel. The miracle is that some do not. That is why the worshippers of Eilistrae deserve so much more historical attention than they usually receive. They are not interesting because they are exceptions one can use to soften the species portrait. They are interesting because they prove that even within the post-descent environment, another jurisprudence of the soul remained possible. Aid the hunted, encourage return, promote harmony, dance under moonlight where you can find it. Help at least one drow free themselves from Lolth's web each moon. These are not just pious gestures. They are a counter-civilization whispered inside the dominant one. And because they whisper rather than rule, they remain hard to count and easy to dismiss, which is how history usually treats its best evidence. Now, from the surface side, the existence of a new deep enemy also changes policy. Border realms, human polities rising later, dwarven holds, merchant consortiums, coastal cities, and adventuring cultures all inherit a world in which below now includes organized dark elven powers shaped by exile and resentment. The Underdark becomes more than monster territory. It becomes political depth. Raids can come from it. Alliances can be made through it. Trade can be diverted by it. Cults can answer to it. Spies can vanish into it. This is one of the long consequences of the crown wars that later campaign eras live inside without always naming. Every later story about drow raiders, subterranean intrigue, disputed passages, or suspicious dark elven trade envoys rests, however distantly, on the civilizational conversion accomplished in this episode. The deep became not only where things hide, but where peoples endure and plan. Now we should say something unpleasant about surface relief. There must have been many in the first years after the descent who felt it. Do not pretend otherwise. Some moon elf, sun elf, or green elf households surely looked upon the absence of dark elven neighbors and felt not sorrow, but release. The fear was gone from the road, or so it seemed. The category that had become the convenient vessel for centuries of outrage had been marked, altered, and removed from ordinary sight. Forest paths felt safer. Court language could harden into retrospect. Parents could explain the age to children more simply. That sort of relief is one of the great moral narcotics of collective punishment. We have solved it, people say, which really means we have removed from sight the population that forced us to keep thinking. The tragedy, of course, is that such relief always comes with deferred cost. Because the punished survive elsewhere, the unresolved history does not die. It reorganizes. The Drow do not cease. They return as raiders, traders, conquerors, refugees, rebels, priestesses, assassins, and supplicants. They return in rumor before they return in force. They return in cults beneath cities that believe themselves safe. They return in the uneasy conscience of those who know what their own gods and priests once did. They return in every later child taught to fear the dark below ground without also being taught why there are peoples in that dark at all. So the surface buys temporary narrative simplicity at the price of a 10,000-year wound. That is a poor bargain. But civilizations drunk on closure make it all the time, and then call their descendants prudent for inheriting the consequences. Now, one last turn of the lamp toward the Drow themselves. The first generations below would not have known that later ages would remember them as archetypes. They would not have known that human taverns would turn them into bedtime horror. They would not have known that scholars would argue over whether they had always been morally doomed or whether the curse and the caves made them so. They knew only this: the surface was lost, the mark was real, the deep was occupied, the houses were reorganizing, the gods were contending, and survival had become narrower than memory. That knowledge is enough to build a people, not a happy people, a formidable one. And the realms would spend the rest of its history learning what that means. So where does all this leave us, as we stand with one hand still on the warm edge of the folio and the other already feeling for the drawer that contains Elven Court? It leaves us in a world transformed by decisions too large for those who made them to govern afterward. Mieritar is gone into the High Moor, a forest kingdom reduced to poisoned testimony. Chantel has been burned, its woods torn down by decades of dragon-aided fire. Keltormir has learned the bitter wisdom of contraction. Ilefan has prayed itself into vulnerability and then tasted annexation. Arivandar has reached imperial breadth and entered institutional fear. Ilithir has answered tragedy with corruption so open that even vengeance can no longer excuse its language. The Dark Elves have been transformed, marked, and driven below, where exile begins teaching them the disciplines from which later Drow civilizations will emerge. Ilistray's faithful keep alive the memory that the sentence did not define the whole people, even if later ages preferred to behave as though it had. And the Seldarine, having allowed or directed a remedy of appalling breadth, now call the survivors to court because peace did not arise of its own accord. This, then, is the Fourth Crown War's true legacy. Not merely that it ends with the Drow below, but that it proves civilizational judgment can destroy the political middle without restoring trust. The middle matters. Remember that. Chantel had been middle in one way. Mixed, plural, resistant to totalization. Mieritar had been middle in another. Culturally rich, dark elf inclusive, spiritually open to forms of life later ages would struggle even to imagine. The moderate priesthoods and high mages who sought salvation rather than endless retaliatory atrocity were middle too, however flawed. The descent does not restore the middle. It obliterates it more thoroughly. Afterward, the map is richer in empire, exile, court, refuge, and subterranean power than in broad, lived, morally mixed coexistence. That is one reason later Faerûn feels so haunted. Its future was purchased by narrowing too many possible pasts. Now let us ask one final hard question before the archive closes for the night. Was the descent a curse, a transformation, an exile, a judgment, or a beginning? The honest answer is yes, which is intolerably untidy and therefore probably correct. It is a curse because it marks a people bodily and socially under the weight of divine magical condemnation. It is a transformation because the change is not merely external. It reshapes how dark elves are seen, how they must live, and what future institutions become likely. It is an exile, because the movement below is not symbolic. It is geographic, material, sensory, and civilizational. It is a judgment, because it is explicitly tied to the wars, to corruption, to priestly invocation, and to the need for settlement after unbearable violence. And it is a beginning because the drow do not vanish. They become new societies, new theologies, new hatreds, new arts, new memories, new rebellions, new possibilities for return and refusal. All of that lies downstream. That is why this episode, for all its darkness, is not only about endings. It is about lineages. The High Moor will shape later centuries. Evermeet's refuge logic will shape later centuries. Elven court's authority will shape later centuries. The drow beneath southern Faerûn will shape later centuries. Every later surface encounter with dark elves, whether in fear, war, trade, love, misunderstanding, or astonished revision, will carry some residue of this chapter. The Realms is like that. It does not forget cleanly, which is fortunate. If it did, there would be no use for me. Next time we move into Crown War 5 and its aftermath, we will speak of what the elves lost in the largest sense. We will examine Elven Court not merely as symbol, but as institution, judge, participant, compromise, and wound. We will watch the Vishantar Empire begin to fracture under the weight of its own excesses. We will follow the long fallout toward mainland retreat, Evermeet's growing importance, and the cultural amnesia that later surface elves practice with such graceful self-deception. If tonight was the birth of a curse, next time is the attempt, partial, compromised, and far too late, to build order from the smoking remains. But before we part, as is our custom, I leave you with questions. What does it mean when a civilization asks the gods for closure and receives a sentence too broad for justice? Was the true crime of the descent the transformation itself, the forced exile that followed, or the 10,000-year convenience by which later peoples treated the mark as explanation? How much of later drow cruelty belongs to pre-descent corruption, and how much belongs to the brutal education of exile, scarcity, and divine social rejection? If you had stood among those 1,000 priests and high mages praying in free Ilafan for salvation, what would you have asked the Seldarine to do instead? And what frightens you more now that we have gone below together, that the Drow were made by punishment, or that so many later ages preferred the simpler lie that punishment merely revealed what had always been there? Sit with that a while. Do not answer too quickly. Quick answers usually serve the responder more than the dead. If these words reach you by crystal, whisper, sending, mirror, wire, or whatever improbable network your age now mistakes for magic because it is too impatient to study proper spellcraft, then leave your answer where others can find it. Tell me whether the dark disaster feels to you more like murder, taboo, or civilizational self-indictment. Tell me whether the descent can ever be defended without defending collective punishment. Tell me whether Eilistray's long project of return strikes you as hope, resistance, or accusation. Tell me what you think truly built Drow society. The curse, the caves, the gods, or the choices made inside all three. And tell me what drawer you want opened next with the greatest care. Elven Court's first proclamations, the collapse of House Vishan, the rise of Evermeet as refuge, the social making of later Drow cities, or the quieter tragedies of those surface elves who learned too late that victory can look embarrassingly like ruin. Now the folio closes. The dust may settle again. The court adjourns, though history never quite does. Before you climb back toward Waterdeep's damp civility and brighter lies, remember that the archive has a front door now. taleofthelich.com is live, and more transcripts, timelines, and lore scaffolding continue to gather there. If tonight's lesson has left you hungry for the map beneath the map, that is where to go. taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon as well, because apparently even the defense of civilizational memory must eventually submit to cloth. When the hats, shirts, and other wearable proofs of archival stubbornness are ready, you shall be told. I will try not to sound too alarmed when that day comes. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, crafting modern digital systems with the kind of structural patience, clarity, and resilience that older empires might have benefited from had they spent less time sanctifying grievance and more time testing their assumptions. For front-end, back-end, and the careful joining of both, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If tonight's lesson served you, leave a rating or review. These small modern rites matter more than they should in an age where memory is often sorted by algorithms too shallow to distinguish catastrophe from novelty. One act of approval can keep an old war from being buried beneath cheaper noise. And one final note, because the door remains open and the question returns with admirable persistence. If you compose ambient or cinematic music and would like your work considered for this Lorecast, send your track, your name, and your preferred credit to taleofthelich@gmail.com. If your music understands black rain, ruined groves, stone-born memory, and the sound a people makes when the sky is turned into inheritance rather than immediate fact, it may yet belong beneath these lessons. Until next time, my apprentice, close the book, cap the ink, let the shelves keep what they have earned, and remember, the curse was not the end of the story. It was the moment history learned to wear a people's face. Good night, May your path be well lit, your judgment sharper than slogans, and your memory harder to bury than any empire's shame.